Tonight we're very fortunate to have the Cornelius O'Brien Lecture on Historic Preservation. The lecture is made possible by financial support from Mrs. Cornelius O'Brien and her daughter. The primary purpose of the O'Brien Lecture Series is to enable groups and organizations interested in historic preservation to schedule speakers who have outstanding expertise in the field of preservation. The lecture is under the auspices of Indiana University, the Committee on Historic Preservation, Dr. Donald Carmody, Chairman. Don could not be with us this evening, but Dr. John Patton, Professor of Geology and an eminently qualified preservationist, is with us. Dr. Patton, would you stand up, please? Thank you, John, and thank you to the committee as well for making this lecture possible. Our speaker is Dr. James Marston Fitch, eminent architectural historian and preservationist. His 2 volumes on American building, The Historical Forces That Shaped It and The Environmental Forces That Shape It, are classics with regard to the field of history of architecture. He became a lecturer at Columbia in 1948, eventually a professor, and he was responsible for the establishment of the first program in historic preservation in the United States at Columbia University. He has trained many of the younger preservationists who are now implementing the techniques that he pioneered. He has lectured or taught at universities, well, almost around the world, throughout Europe, South America. His awards, of course, are numerous. In 1976, he received the AIA Medal. Also, in that same year, the Department of Interior Conservation Award. In 1976 to 1977, a Guggenheim Fellowship. In 1977, he was awarded the City of New York Mayor's Certificate of Appreciation. And in 1979, he received a Doctor of Arts from Kansas State University. Mr. Fitch has been involved in preservation and restoration as a consultant on numerous significant projects, including the Federal Triangle in Washington, the Woolworth Building in New York City, the Wainwright Building in St. Louis, and the list goes on and on. So it is with great pleasure for me to introduce Dr. James Marston Fitch. The topic of his presentation, Historic Preservation, the Curatorial Management of the Built World.
Working, but
Pardon?
I don't think it's working.
Well, maybe they'll get it right for you.
All right.
I yell so that I can usually try that. If that doesn't work, we'll then bring it up.
Does it? Does it? Yeah. I'm the victim of a particularly vicious summer cold, and I have here a whole pharmacopoeia which I hope will help me get through the evening at an audible level, including a bottle of cough medicine which I got in the airport this morning. Can't hear. How can this be amplified? How can an amplifier be amplified? How's that? Wouldn't you think that if we can get men on the moon with such ease that we could build an architectural building in which the acoustics In any case, I just want to tell you that I got on a plane packed in between 2 perfectly innocent men who already were dismayed at the way I was coughing and had decided that I should have been put in a leper's colony instead of a plane. And then they saw me with this bottle, and that made them even more questionable. And finally I told them, don't worry, I'm not a wino, it's cough medicine. And then I looked at the recipe, and it's 45% alcohol, so that's... their suspicions were correct. The title that I've chosen tonight is a very apt one, I think. At least it's very correct. This is what I'd like to talk about. The curatorial management of the built world. The term historic preservation is now generic. It's a term that most of the national legislation, local, regional, municipal legislation, this is the umbrella term. All the big organizations in the field employ it. So I think that we're stuck with it as a matter of common usage. But it's perfectly clear that we're describing a field of activity that is not enormously more broader in scope and richer and more varied in content than is suggested by the term historic preservation. What we're really talking about is a whole new concept of responsibility, especially for the design professions and for the related scientific fields where they impinge upon us, geography, physics, chemistry. And the distinguishing characteristic of this definition is precisely that it sees the world as a built unit. It sees, for example, that there's no longer, at least in the USA, any possibility of distinguishing between God-made and man-made artifacts. The interfaces are too close. It sees that there's no longer any possibility of distinguishing between enclosed space like this building and the open space that surrounds it, which hitherto we've been inclined to think of as voids, as empty spaces. And the word curatorial, I think, should be taken very seriously. A curator, you know, is a caretaker. And curators in the modern world have very special functions. Most architects are the victims of educational system which doesn't really inculcate this concept. In fact, I think you could easily conclude, if you looked around you, that architects were trained at the destruction of the landscape rather than taking care of it. So that I think when an audience like this, how can I take this load off my hands? Can we attach it? I said, yep, attach it again. Next. Hold it. Attach it. There. How's that? Working? It's a measure of a change in the times, the tempo of the times, that an audience like this, as large as this, which I assume is made up largely, if not exclusively, of people who hope to be interventors in the physical fabric of the world. It's interesting that you turn out for a lecture like this, which 10 years ago probably would not have been at all popular. In other words, I think it's dawning on everybody that the whole world is at risk. Literally, the entire world is at risk, and every part of it. And it's preposterous to think that architects could continue indefinitely to build isolated jewel boxes for IBM and the Deer Plow people in completely without context, in complete contempt or ignorance, contempt for or ignorance of the context in which these isolated artifacts take place. Now, I don't mean to suggest that this is the only future for architects, for the professions of landscape architecture, architecture and planning. There will obviously continue to be a need in the modern world for a whole range of facilities whose size and complexity will continue to demand specially designed new buildings. But I think that the proportion of practice of this sort is steadily dwindling, percentage-wise, and the proportion of activity in the fields called historic preservation is steadily rising. In my opinion, it can only go up. I don't see any other way in which it can go. And I think that the energy crisis, which has only begun to barely disturb the fringes of our consciousness. In fact, out here in Indiana, it doesn't look as though it's had any effect on you people at all so far, judging by the great big bloated automobiles that you glide around in. But I can predict that even Indiana, sooner or later, is going to feel the cold breath of the energy shortage. I also happen to think, as somebody who's trained as an architect, that this is a very thrilling field. I think it's wrong for designers to think that there's something narrowly restrictive, limiting, or paralyzing about being compelled to work in and with and amidst built fabric and tissue. I think this is a complete misconception, and the schools, I think, are largely responsible for having propagated this idea that a real designer can only operate when somebody's bulldozed off 300 acres and he has a clean slate on which to display his talent. The fact is, I think just the contrary. I think that all artistic and creative people operate best when there are very real restrictions, very real parameters to what they can do. The great musical radical, early part of the 20th century, Stravinsky, whose music at that time was astounding the world for its novelty, he said even then that complete freedom was the enemy of art. He said, when all things are possible, nothing is possible. And I think that applies with great force to the field that we're in. I've brought along tonight a range of case histories, which I hope will enable you to see share my apprehension, my understanding of this field. And you'll see that the case histories are of two sorts. On the one hand, we're going to discuss very briefly a whole range of artifacts from very large God-made elements down to very small man-made elements, and to see that this whole spectrum of size falls within our province of this new term, curatorial management, and on the other hand, to see that there's a whole range of therapies available to us as curators. If artifacts are brought to us that are in damaged or diseased condition, there's a whole spectrum of things that can be done to save the artifact. So I think if we may have the lights up, we might look at some of these case history. The first one that I show you is a very large artifact indeed. It consists not only of the great fortress that Toussaint Louverture built after he had kicked Napoleon out of Haiti, the fortress, the citadel to which he retired as the head of the first black republic in the nation, but also the entire landscape within the range of view. Here you have an aerial view looking at the citadel, and here you have a view of northern Haiti from the citadel. This has all in recent years been declared a national park. The fortress itself is being restored physically, and inside the fortress will be installed two new museums. One, a museum of the history of the Haitian people, and the other a museum of the black culture of the Caribbean basin. But what's interesting about this is that the government has decided not merely to restore this and preserve this citadel, but actually to intervene in the future of the whole landscape, because this is the landscape that Toussaint Louverture actually saw in 1804. He selected this spot because of its strategic location, and the plans for this great park are to preserve it in exactly the situation, the condition it was in when Toussaint Louverture was there in 1804. Now, there's really nothing romantic about this. This was a populated landscape then, and it's a populated landscape now. It's, a matter of fact, filled with little houses, hovels, and little patches of garden crops that the peasants have helped out. And the hope is that the government can intervene in such a fashion as to raise the level of life of these peasants, which is abysmally low, by a number of devices, including bringing tourism into the palace, but at the same time preserve the character of this, for them, very important landscape. I personally think this is a really thrilling concept and shows a whole new dimension on the part of our attitudes toward the world we live in. We can find, of course, smaller elements, in this case a wholly man-made landscape, Central Park, which is exactly 100 years old this year, and which is in serious need. It's an artifact that has very serious pathologies. It requires a wholly new level of study and intervention. And as a matter of fact, we're just now completing, for one small section of the park, a fundamental study on how it should be repaired, restored, returned to the condition in which Olmsted envisioned it, and then specific program for maintaining it in that fashion. A more familiar scale, of course, environmentally, is that one finds around monuments of recognized importance, like cathedrals. This happens to be the cathedral in Prague, the Tin Church in Prague, which is in the center of the historic district. And like many countries in Europe today, monuments of this order, of this first order, have a very special status. They not only own the view that the world has of them, they also control the view of the world from their point of view, so to say. And what this means is that in the whole 360-degree arc that this cathedral dominates, anything that interferes, mutilates, or reduces our appreciation of the cathedral is verboten. And on the contrary, on the other side of the same coin, anything in this whole perimeter that threatens the aesthetic integrity of the cathedral is also verboten. So you can say in poetic terms that the cathedral owns the world's view of it and its view of the world. And this, in my opinion, is a very high-level approach to this problem. Now, as I said, I don't think you should for a minute assume that this means that there's not going to be any activity in this landscape. On the contrary, it leaves room for an enormous amount of activity, but activity of a very special sort. And in the case of Prague, which has a great shortage of hotel space in the old city, several enclaves in this area, right around the cathedral, have been selected, historic enclaves, have been selected for adaptive use as new touristic hotels. And here you see one of them in the process of being modified, and you see the tin church towers in the background. These are the architect's plans for this reuse of old tissue. This is a medieval street, fundamentally a medieval street lined with medieval houses, and each of these houses has been carefully studied, and its historic and aesthetic assets have been analyzed, and then the plans have been evolved, whereby, on the one hand, those features which are valuable will be preserved, and on the other hand, facilities for a thoroughly modern hotel will be inserted in these cavities. And studies that have been made for this, the preliminary studies are of this order. You'll see that they are fundamentally scenographic. In other words, the controlling design decisions in a problem like this are not purely functional at all. The consequences of your intervention in the landscape have to be thoroughly, or the cityscape, have to be thoroughly visualized, so a great number of studies of this sort are made. I haven't been back to Prague since this hotel was finished, but I'm sure that it's one of a number of interventions of this sort that the Czechs have handled very effectively. Here's another example. Yes, I'm glad somebody's focusing. Here's another example of the same phenomenon, this time from the city of Chartres. The cathedral at Chartres, of course, has always dominated the landscape. It was built specifically for that purpose, or at least the towers were. And in recent years, there's been a very elaborate, complex program in the city of Chartres to stabilize, beautify, and formalize this connection between the cathedral and its city. And it's an extremely interesting procedure that's now very well along. It really means that almost every building in this field of view, it has been or is in the process of being restored, reconditioned. When the program is finished, every one of these buildings, whether they're old or new, will actually constitute thoroughly modern housing, meeting all the requirements of modern civilization. Here you have the cathedral's view of its town, and you can see, even with the naked eye, interventions. There are a number of new buildings being inserted in the voids around the church, but the overriding parameters of design are that not only do these new structures not challenge or weaken the dominance of the center, but that they are designed to consolidate and strengthen this domination. Now, there may be people in this audience who find that an absolutely intolerable kind of assignment for an architect. And at the level of civil liberties, of course, you're perfectly entitled to have that opinion. But I happen to think that this is a highly civilized and wonderfully exciting new kind of application of our collective talents. I think the assignment to do a new building in an old context like this is incomparably more challenging than a commission to do a 124-story skyscraper for Sears Roebuck, which, you know, is as destructive of the cityscape as any 6 atomic bombs. That's my personal prejudice. Now, actually, as a result of recent history, we've discovered that we can rebuild whole cities, repair whole cities, very large cities, if necessary. And one of the most dramatic, terribly dramatic examples of this is the way the Polish people, have reconstructed their entire capital city of Warsaw. Absolutely amazing job. The Germans left the city 88% destroyed. This would have been a typical streetscape after the Germans left, actually a year after they left, because the rubble over the whole city was 18 or 20 feet deep. And here the work of cleaning is well along. And 10 years later, this is the kind of streetscape that the Poles have reconstructed. And the entire center of Warsaw, which the city as a whole is a city of 1.25 million people, so the entire center probably houses 300,000 people, has been completely restored, reconstructed, repaired, and the whole level brought up to this, the whole city brought up to this level of urbanity. Now, God forbid that Chicago or Indianapolis would ever be struck by a military disaster like Warsaw. Although if you go through South Chicago on the elevated, you could easily think that you were in Warsaw if you look out the window. But the point I want to make is that it's perfectly possible to consider even enormous organisms like this, terribly diseased organisms, to understand that if we have a policy of regeneration, of retrieval and recycling, that this is not completely possible. There's nothing mysterious about it. So these damaged cities of Europe, reconstructed cities, in that sense, I think offer us Americans are wonderful paradigms of how, if we really had civilized policies, we would save, for example, the city of Cleveland, Ohio. Physically, I mean, save it. As a result of modern development, there's another new phenomenon in the world, and that is that the rapid development of mechanization has made obsolete not only individual buildings, isolated buildings, but actually whole towns, whole communities, because of some fundamental shift in the economy, find themselves adrift and without the normal economic support that they're accustomed to. And so we find an increasing understanding that these settlements are very valuable to the culture of the nation, and that we have to intervene. They will not survive unless there's conscious intervention. In this case, you're looking at a ravishingly beautiful little city in Czechoslovakia called Telch, which was historically a market center, like one of our county seats, and its main function was local marketing, weekend marketing. With the collectivization of Czech agriculture, the whole economic basis of a town like this has disappeared. The foodstuffs are now handled in a totally different fashion, and new methods have to be uncovered to save this town as a living organism. It's inhabited by about 2,700 people, and the problem is not merely to preserve the buildings, but also to preserve the people. In other words, the inhabitants as well as the habitat. And that's been done in Telch, and it's being done in many cities around the world. And again, the thing I think that distinguishes this scale of intervention is our understanding that it's the whole organism that has to be preserved, that you can't just save odd bits of it. It won't survive. In this country, we have increasing, I'm glad to report, we have an increasing number of activities of the same sort. This happens to be a Shaker village in Massachusetts, which through some accident of history survived intact down at the present time, and a handful of local people understood not merely its cultural and artistic significance, but understood that it could be converted into an educational instrument of the very highest order. So they have taken this village over and now operate it as an outdoor architectural museum, and it's in something like 14 years has become a phenomenally successful activity. Of course, it's not like, from a social point of view, it's not an inhabited artifact like the town you just saw. This is a museum village. You have a similar, almost identical case down in Kentucky, below Lexington, of a Shaker village that's been beautifully restored there. In all these cases, you see, we discover that these are not merely agglomerations of interesting old buildings, but they actually become generators. In the very act of saving these buildings, we found that they become generators of whole new ranges of activity, which no one would have thought of otherwise. One of the most spectacular cases of saving a historic district of an old city is what's happened in Charleston in the last 30, 40 years. Here you see an aerial view of the peninsula on which Charleston sits. And the salvation of Charleston has been accomplished almost exclusively until recent years by amateurs. And you got to remember that the word amateur used to be not a bocce workman, but a person who did something for love rather than for pay. That's the proper definition of amateur. And about 40 years ago, seeing that this whole artifact was threatened, a handful of little old ladies, blue hair and tennis shoes, mobilized themselves to save the city. And in 31, they had this much of it designated. In 66, they had this much of it designated. In 75, they had this much of it designated. Even some of these intrusions have now been closed up, and the whole peninsula is secure. But what one must realize is that not only has the physical fabric of the city been saved, but the city has been given a wholly new economic base. Tourism is now the biggest industry in Charleston. So an intervention like this is not in any sense a dead museological activity, but actually a very lively and in many cases the only economic solution to the life of the organism. We have other cases by now all over the country of interventions of varying degrees of success. This is an early one in Philadelphia, Society Hill, where a whole section of Philadelphia was declared an historic district. Here the planners and architects decided that unlike Charleston, they would not require that new tissue be a replica of the old. In other words, that here are some of the old buildings of the typical late 18th century facade, but they would set up standards whereby new buildings could be inserted which would be congruent with the old but didn't have to match it exactly. And here was one example, a really quite nice house. This was a gap which has now been filled, so that to appreciate this house you have to realize it's a facade architecture like all the rest. In that sense, Philadelphia has been a pioneer in an effort to establish criteria for new tissue in old fabric. Here's another view. Of course, hundreds of views are possible of this area. Another view of a series of old buildings in the process right now of being rehabilitated. Completely new structures at the end of the street, which the architects at least think are congruent with the old. And then Pay's famous towers in the background, about which there's an increasing, I think, question as to whether or not this form of intervention was ideal. But in any case, it's another example of how these matters progress. One more recent intervention at a district scale that I find very interesting, not architecturally, I don't think it involves any great architecture, but urbanistically I think it's extremely successful. This is an aerial view of Salt Lake City. taken a few years ago with the temple and in its compound, which of course is the center of Salt Lake, and give you some idea of the context in which the temple stood. They developed plans whereby new axial access, visual access to the temple would be achieved along this street. This is all church property. And they've now largely completed this intervention, and as I say, I think it's an extremely successful instance of how a group of buildings, I suppose if you were a Mormon, you'd have a special affection for this pastiche. I mean, it's a typical Victorian conceit, but obviously for the Mormons it's something much more. It occupies the center of the city, and from a symbolical point of view, it deserves the attention it's getting. So the decision was made to demolish these disparate structures and erect a complex of church offices along this side, to demolish these buildings and extend the hotel, which also belongs to the church, to the edge of the new plaza. And this has been done. It is now complete. And as I say, I think it has some very interesting lessons for us as urbanists and architects. This is a shot, the temple in this picture, of course, is behind you, and this is a shot of the newly exposed rear facades of this hotel. Facades which, of course, were never designed to have been seen. And the decision then was to enlarge the hotel. It's one of the best run hotels in the whole USA, to extend it out to the new plaza, to give it a white terrazzo surface which replicated the Beaux-Arts surface of the old building, and thereby make the monumentality, to give the hotel a complete monumentality as opposed to just two monumental facades. This is the end of the construction before the landscaping had been done and the hoarding taken away, but you can see that the position of the hotel in the cityscape has been enormously consolidated, that it actually acts as a kind of pivot, a very important pivot for the whole experience of this part of the city. And it seems to me that their decision to replicate the old terracotta was entirely correct. This doesn't by any means imply that I believe terracotta is a uniquely handsome material, or that the Beaux-Arts is a specially distinguished style. But I think if you look at the thing from the standpoint of overall integrity, one has to admire what they've done. And this is the outburst shot when the landscaping had just begun, indicating the totally new position of the cathedral in the cityscape, and showing how this enlarged hotel and the new buildings on the other side have been used to consolidate this position of the church, which after all is the centerpiece of the whole city. Very often, of course, increasingly, it's not possible to save old buildings, no matter how valuable they are. And the only way to save them turns out to be to move them. And then the question arises, where should you move them to? Where can you find a home for a homeless building? And one increasingly important device has been the so-called outdoor architectural museum, in which buildings of recognized value are organized on a straight curatorial basis in a context that replicates their original. This happens to be a farm complex from the great folk Loristic Museum in Stockholm, called Sconson. And here you're looking at one of about 60 or 70 farm complexes that has been brought in completely and reconstituted in this museum, all the way down to the stones in the basement, even the weeds in the yard are all accurate replicas of the original situation. So that now Sweden has a national museum of folkloristic architecture. And we begin to see this now, same tendency appearing in this country. For example, it's Wisconsin, I believe, or Minnesota, that is just now in the process of creating such a museum of the rural architecture of the state, in which farms from every ethnic group will be brought in and organized in a natural setting. I apologize for this slide. I used it recently, and a young woman came up to, or a student came up to me. The fact she was female has nothing to do with it. She complimented me on my subject matter, but said she was appalled at the low level of my graphic materials. So I asked her what. And she said, well, that slide you showed of Wisconsin, I'm really shocked that a person of your status would show it. And, you know, I want to say, my dear young lady, if you knew how much time it took me to get this bloody photograph, this aerial view from Sweden, to get it through the customs, to clear it. I just tell you this anecdote. She has no comprehension of how much trouble it is to get these goddamn things. But in any case, so she gives me a lecture on how I need more polished slides, and I agree with her. I do need them, but it's the best I can do. Another interesting example, see, still smaller in scale, is the possibility, if you can't save an entire house, of saving a part of it. This is a view of a living room in the Little House, a great Frank Lloyd Wright country house that he did before World War I in Minnesota. And the house, the family died out, and the house was at risk for sale. And an effort was waged to save the house in situ. This is a drawing, original Wright sketch, including Wright's doodling on the margins of this house. It became impossible. They couldn't organize the resources to save the whole house. So the Metropolitan Museum of Art agreed to take responsibility for reconstituting the living room in the New American Wing in New York. And that process is now approaching completion. The wing will be open next year. Here you have Wright's own floor plan of the house, showing the furnishings that he proposed for it, all of them designed by him. And we know from the records, of course, that the room really was furnished this way. So we met curators using material of this sort. This is obviously a very late view with many pieces of furniture that Mr. Wright would have abhorred and would have ordered out. But it's data like this that the curators will use It's data like this that the curators will use to reconstitute this artifact with maximum verisimilitude in the New American Wing. So even a room, even an orphan room, if it's important enough, can be saved. Don't let any hard-headed Chamber of Commerce person tell you it can't be. It can, provided the determination exists in the community to do so. Here's a forlorn little artifact that's in the process of being preserved. It turns out to be extremely significant. It's one of the oldest steam engines left alive, if that's the word, proper phrase, in the Haitian jungle, 1816, and it was built in Maryland to power a sugar mill. It's been recently rediscovered It's been measured and documented by the historic engineering record, the Park Service, and plans are now underway for its complete conservation. It's not yet clear where it will be exhibited, but the point at issue here is that from the point of view of culture, the preservation of this little engine is quite as important and maybe even more important than the preservation of Wright's living room. This is not an either-or proposition. Our responsibilities are going to cover all artifacts like this. This is another very important industrial artifact from Cuba, a very early sugar grinding engine. This also is now in the process of being conserved. And you see, just the design problem of conceiving a proper structure in which artifacts like this could be exhibited seems to me by itself to be a fascinating problem. I don't know why any talented designer wouldn't leap at the opportunity of giving these little engines a kind of ambience, a kind of protection from the weather that they are entitled to. Now, on the other side of the ledger, the whole question of what level of intervention is required, will be required of you. This ranges, again, through a full spectrum of from conservative to radical techniques. Here you're looking at the Temple of Ise, which is in the south of Japan. This beautiful building is a replica. It's the 38th, I believe it is the 38th replica in its line of a building that was originally constructed in the year 930. And every 20 years since then, this fabric, this artifact, has been immaculately reconstructed. And it's been done in this kind of a phase. The temple compound consists of two lobes. And here is the old replica that's on its way out, having served 20 years. And here is the new replica that's just finished and is just ready to be opened. Now, you see, very, very important cultural considerations are involved here. These are not just a bunch of fuddy-duddy, unwashed old monks at work. I mean, they have very serious problems. One is the preservation of, the presentation to their faithful of a temple that's immaculate, immaculately new, clean, polished, and bright. And this temple is built of thatch and wood. And in a climate like Japan, no thatch and no wood stays immaculate very long. So actually, for the monks to have worked out this technique is a very sage one. It's a very logical response to the needs that faced them. In any case, we can say without any shadow of a doubt, this is the world's oldest preservation project. The oldest, what's commonly recognized as the oldest preservation project in Europe is Viollet-le-Duc's reconstruction of this great chateau for Napoleon III. This took place in the 1850s when Napoleon decided he needed a new guest house for the imperial family. And Le-Duc, who was a well-trained French architect, in the process became the first, really the father of historic preservation. He made many mistakes like all pioneers, but he's unquestionably the first of his sort. The same year that he started this, of course, a handful of little old ladies with blue hair and tennis shoes saved Mount Vernon. You remember that heroic story there. They were, of course, complete amateurs while he was Viollet Leduc was a professional. And here you get this artifact, immaculate conserved. This is probably, aside from that temple in Japan, this is probably one of the most immaculately researched, labored over, and loved a restoration project anywhere in the world. And if you go there today, you can be quite sure that everything you see, every plant, every piece of furniture, everything in the field of view is as close to the way it was when George Washington died as culture makes possible. And today we have some very interesting arguments going on, this question of preservation versus restoration. Here in Mount Vernon, the objective was very clear. They wanted to take the whole mansion and its grounds back to the condition it was in, let's say, the day that Washington died. That's called restoration. And that's obviously a more radical form of intervention than just simple preservation. However, it's not always as easy, to make distinctions between these two as you might like to. Here, for example, is the architect's sketch. Two of them I'll show them in rapid order. Two ways in which one building might be handled, a building of great historic and urbanistic significance to New York and the South Street Seaport. It's a very unusual building typologically. It's the first, as far as we can tell, the first commercial structure ever erected in the USA that had conscious monumental pretensions. In other words, when old Mr. Schermerhorn decided to build this row, these are actually standard New York City row houses. But he decided to build them in such a fashion that when they were complete, they would have a monumental quality. They would have a role in the cityscape which was above and beyond anything that commercial buildings had ever had in New York before. In this sense, these buildings were begun in 1811, 1812, just 100 years before the Woolworth building. You see, the Woolworth building was also called a temple of commerce, and it reflected Mr. Woolworth's ambitions. He wanted not merely a big office building, he wanted a building that read like a temple. And this was obviously the motivation of Mr. Schermerhorn. Now, the question that's now going on in New York is whether the building should be restored to this condition. This is all based on ample documentary evidence, and it's probably as close as we can get to the way it looked in 1820 as possible, or whether it should be restored, whether it should be restored, preserved in such a fashion that this portion would be restored and this portion would preserve an 1865 hotel, a modernization, obviously, of the old tissue. In this instance, though I'm normally in favor of preservation because it's the most conservative, in this case, I happen to think the entire building should be taken back to the original. And here I hope I'm acting according to sound museological principles. But this artifact was unusual, avant-garde when it was built, and it is almost absolutely unique today. Those are really the two criteria, I think, that museum operators employ. Whereas Second Empire buildings like this are a dime a dozen. In Manhattan we can find hundreds of them. Any case, I think the project is going to be handled in this fashion and not according to mine, but it suggests some of the fascinating problems that you get into in areas like this. Here's another, even more radical form of intervention, which we call reconstitution in the field, in which, for any number of reasons, the only way to save a building is to take it down, take it apart, and reconstitute it, either in situ or someplace else. This is the way the Illinois state capitol looked about 10 years ago in the center of Springfield. They had already started to peel the copper off the dome. That explains that. Now, how to handle this building became the center of a raging controversy, a very productive controversy, in my opinion. The planners had dictated this sat and sits in the center of Springfield on the central square. And of course, the planners lusted after this as the obvious place in which to put a 3-story underground parking garage. And so they proposed to demolish the old building, throw it away, and put their garage there. And this raised a storm of protest, again by the amateurs and the antiquarians, who pointed out that in addition to being a handsome building, this was the building, happened to be the building in which the only state funeral for Abraham Lincoln had been held. Apparently, for some odd reason, there was no state funeral in Washington. And these old fuddy-duddies, these blue-haired ladies, argued, in my opinion, with stunning accuracy that it was barbarous for the State Highway Department to talk about demolishing this building to make way for 3 stories of fat-ass Buicks. And they organized such an effective campaign that they got the planners and the highway people into full retreat, and finally a compromise was effected. Actually, I think by this time they didn't need to compromise, but they did. And what they agreed upon was that the building would indeed be taken apart, stone by stone, and then it would be ultimately reconstituted along the lines in such a fashion that visually, cosmetically, it would be the building in which Lincoln's body lay in state in April of '65. So it was agreed then that the reconstituted building would have this plan with these great public rooms on the second floor, including the Senate chamber, the House of Representatives, in which the body, the catafalque, had laid. And then it would have this relationship to the new garage. It would have the staterooms reconstituted above grade, and then below grade, whole new fireproof facility for the State Historical Commission for its records. And the garage then would be built around it. So that was the plan that was finally adopted. It was a fascinating job that, as I said, the building was taken apart stone by stone, brick by brick. They never found any documents. The architects found no documents of any sort indicating what it would have been like internally. So they were required to reconstitute the building just in the process of taking it down, just as any good archaeologist would do. It was on that basis that they prepared those plans you saw. So it was all taken down, the stones were stored. Here you see the hole in the ground where the garage was going to be. This is the plane, the wing of the plane that took the picture, obviously. Here you see the armature, the concrete armature on which the old marble facing was to be hung. Here you have a paradox, you see, of a building of which only the exterior surfaces are historic. The inside had been remade so many times there was no possibility of anything but a complete restoration. So the old marble slabs were hung on the face of the concrete armature. Here's the building largely intact with the dendriform columns to carry the trees and landscaping of the plaza. And I'm sorry. Also, the building has been returned to its original relationship to the grade. In the 1880s, it had been jacked up 17 feet. A new story had been run under it. So, for maximum verisimilitude, it was returned to its original position in space. Building and so forth. And on the basis of this, plus the archaeological evidence, they were able to reconstruct the chamber completely. It's been furnished with appropriate antiques of the proper period, and this is the way it looks today. This is a very radical, obviously, a very radical kind of intervention to carry on in any artifact, but it seems to me that here the antiquarians were entirely correct. In fact, nobody in Springfield would dare to challenge that correctness today. I've talked to planners who've looked me straight in the eye and said they were in favor of this all along, when I know perfectly well that they led the battle to have the building demolished. But that's all right, you know, as long as people join your side, it really doesn't matter how immaculate their morals are. But again, you see, I think we have a case of where the citizens themselves intervened, and very correctly, in a manner that the professionals simply weren't competent to handle. And here you have a photograph of the building as it looks today. This is a little project in which I happen to have been involved. Has some interesting aspects. This is the Bank of California in downtown San Francisco. It happens to be the oldest building in downtown San Francisco because plans for it had been completed before the earthquake of 1907, and consequently the owners were able to get right into action. This is the way the building looked a few years ago when the bank decided it had to have more space. Initially, the obvious suggestion was to demolish this. It's a very choice piece of property right in the heart of the financial district, to demolish this and put up a high-rise in its place. Some of the board members showed surprising sensitivity and decided this was not correct, that this was by a landmark, by San Francisco standards, a landmark, and the old banking room should be restored to its original condition and a new high-rise put up alongside it. That's what was done, and I was the consultant to the firm that did it. And what we did in the process, you see, where you'd had a visual slum before. Originally, of course, this was the biggest building in the district, so what the people did on the roof was not apparent to anybody else. But now it's surrounded by very tall buildings. And what you had was a visual slum, and we decided to persuade the owners to convert that visual slum into a little piazza in the sky, which they've done. And so what was an eyesore has become an asset. This also has a utilitarian function. It's the dining room and clubhouses for employees of the bank, and a new high-rise has been built alongside it. I have no special brief for the architecture, but we're talking about a problem of a really higher level than just architectural detail. It did present one very intriguing problem, and that was how, in cosmetic terms, how we could restore the integrity of this Corinthian temple, not merely restore it, but consolidate it so that it had a stronger position in the landscape than before. And this meant, obviously, that we should give it a third dimension, that it should return on itself. And that, for a while, had us stumped because we didn't see how we could return this granite facade with this cornice onto a skeletal structure. But then we discovered that we could quite easily put one of the fire towers at this corner. And this gave us the base, the visual base against which we could return the cornice. I think this is a valid urbanistic enterprise. And regardless of what you might think of the details, it seems to me the sort of thing that increasingly we're going to have to develop competence in. At the present time, American architects have a very low level of sensitivity to this kind of issue. Then there are other reasons for intervening. This is another one of those slides that young lady thought I shouldn't show you because of the crude manner in which it's mounted, where you have to intervene in the life of the building, not because it's no longer useful, but because it's physically at risk, that if you don't consolidate it, it's going to fall down. And the Europeans have been especially adventurous in this area, especially the Italians. And I wanted to tell a young lady that the next time she went to Venice, if she could hire a gondola and persuade him to gather in the middle of this choppy water and hold the boat there while I took the photograph of the campanile, then maybe she could forgive me for not having properly mounted it. But in any case, this building, this campanile, was in serious danger of collapse. And what was done by the engineers is really a miracle of intervention. It was a solid brick masonry pylon, on piles, of course, wooden piles. And before they could touch the foundations, they had to consolidate the tower itself. And to do this, they used a new technique using high-powered water-cooled drills, very much like the dentist uses on your teeth. And they drilled this pattern of holes through the brick masonry, all four sides. In these cavities, they inserted stainless steel reinforcing rods. And then around the rods, they injected a very rich cement mortar mix. And by this means, they converted this fragile brick campanile into a solid reinforced concrete monolith. Having done that, then they were able to tackle the question of the footings. And here they used something of the same technique, a form which the Italians call radici, which means roots. And they use drills of the same sort, larger drills, and they drill through the mud as far down as they have to go. And in these cavities, they insert spiral reinforcing, and then they pump it full of grout, and they've got concrete piling in place. So by that method, this tower has been beautifully conserved. And this kind of technology goes on all over Europe at the same time that the architect for the White House continues to assure us that there's no way to save the west facade of the Capitol. A level of illiteracy that you wouldn't expect in a senator from Louisiana. But, this is kind of discrepancy, how far behind we are in the States. Here's another nice little story of civilian victories. Again in Salt Lake City, a facade, cast iron and sheet metal facade, which for just short of 100 years had been the face of the ZCMI, that's a Zion Commercial Mercantile Institute, the big department store of Salt Lake City, owned by the Mormon Church. And about 10 years ago, the managers announced to a startled world that they were going to build a great big new monolithic air-conditioned store, and that unfortunately this elegant little facade would have to go. Well, again, they ran into some really vivid opposition. They were forced to retreat, and finally they threw in the flag and they agreed to disassemble the entire facade and then reconstitute it in the face of the facade of the new building. And that's been done and done very successfully. And I'm sorry that my photographs are so inadequate, because I really think that what they've accomplished here is quite impressive. The building, as you can see, is a big block, anonymous block, windowless block. This recess was created especially to to accept or receive this new facade. And the facade has been very carefully detailed so that even to a layman, I think it reads as a screen. You could never be under any misapprehension that you're dealing any longer with a load-bearing structure. And the cast iron members have been hung on a very elegant armature in Corten steel, the same kind of technique that we saw in Springfield, Illinois. And again, very handsomely detailed, so it's very clear that this fragile old Victorian facade is supported on this modern screen. The sheet metal roofing ceilings from in the store have been used in the ceilings of the loggia. This then acts as a loggia with the show windows and entrances for the department store behind them. The color scheme, they did work on the paint, and they discovered that it hadn't been that lavender and white that somebody had thought, but actually had been a very vigorous brown and beige and gold leaf, and that's the color scheme that's been used. And this is a photograph that's very hard to read, but here you're looking up in this loggia at the way they've reused the sheet metal. A lot of this is sheet metal and not cast iron, and I think it's one of the first few cases we've got, the first case we've got of a monumental sheet iron facade having been restored. Then, of course, as I've said, very often we have to move buildings in order to save them. They're at risk in their previous site, and we've all seen this kind of strategy. The decision is made to move it, then we have to work out a trajectory to get it from where it is to where it ought to be. And this involves all kinds of elaborate arrangements with the police department, the fire department, and so forth. Here we have an early Dutch house being moved to Bethpage Village on Long Island, a house of great historic importance, no special artistic importance, and it had to be cut into pieces in order to move it. And here we find the same house in its reconstituted form. Here, of course, the curators have taken the opportunity to take the artifact back, not to the condition it was in when they had to move it, but into the condition which in their opinion was most significant historically, which was in the 18th century. If you can't move it on truck, you can often move it on a boat. This is the last Coast Guard station on the East Coast, a building type that's now extinct because, of course, radar has taken over completely the information, the signaling system of the old days, and this little shingle Coast Guard station and lighthouse was deemed important enough to be saved. It was standing on a beach that was being eroded, so the decision was made by the Park Service to move it to another spot, and here you see it being towed across the bay to another point. Incidentally, this is in the best historic tradition. When Charles Dickens visited Boston, he said it's a remarkable town on many counts, and he said in the morning when you start down the street, you should never be surprised to see a house coming down the street toward you. He said the Bostonians move houses all the time. And as a matter of fact, he said they also move across the bay. So this is not a new technique, apparently. And if you can't move it by water, you may have to move it by rail. This is a really remarkable project, technologically, in Prague, in northwestern Czechoslovakia, the cathedral church of a little town called Most. And Most turned out to be a medieval city, a town, turned out to be based on the richest coal deposit in that part of the country. So the decision was made to move the entire town from its location in the valley to a new site in the hills 3 miles away. Many of the older buildings were indeed moved, smaller buildings, but then they came to the question of this church. And it was a very, first of all, it was a very rare type, according to art historians, a very unique building, and consequently merited being saved. Then the question was how to save it, whether to disassemble it and put it back stone by stone, or to build a facsimile up on the hill and throw this away. And finally the decision was made it should be moved intact. To do this, they built a railroad line from its present site to its proposed site. Well, the first thing, of course, they had to do was put the whole church on a concrete slab, reinforced concrete slab, a platform. And then under the platform, they built a railroad line. And on the railroad line, they put 56 little cars. You can see them here. And these cars, oh, wait a minute. Here's the interior of the church, braced for its movement. And you can see this network of steel and timber framing aimed at holding the whole fabric intact when it was moved. And at each of the critical points, there are sensors, stress sensors, that are plugged into a central computer, so that as the church began to move, whenever there was any movement in any one of these joints, the message was sent to the central computer, and the central computer in turn controlled the hydraulic jacks on each of these 56 cars. So this antique fabric was moved slowly across the valley and up into the new town with this most sophisticated system making all these adjustments. I haven't seen it since it was moved, but this was what was happening when we were there, and I hear the movement is successful. Another demonstration you see of the almost limitless capacity that we have to intervene, provided we choose to do so. There's nothing new about using this technology in space science or nuclear physics, that we're all familiar with this. But the idea of using this level of sophistication to keep the world worth living in, I think, is a rather new and radical concept. Then, of course, you have artifacts that float, that are not attached to land, and there are all sorts of ways these can be conserved. This is an aerial view of the model of South Street Seaport in New York, where an already large collection of ships is going to be housed and displayed according to modern museological methods, and the ships themselves are all in the process of conservation. Well, one of the most interesting examples of this is the conservation of the warship Vasa in Sweden. This was a great galleon, a modern pace-setting warship built in the 1630s by the Swedish crown. It was equipped with cannons and men, the whole thing, and it set out to sea to conquer I don't know what, with a great fanfare, and it sank right in the middle of the harbor with everybody on board. And so its presence there has been known for centuries. And finally, the Swedish government decided to raise the Vasa for its historic, technological interest, and using all the techniques of modern marine navigation, submersibles, and the rest. They raised this old hulk, this wooden hulk, and here you see it. It's been raised in a crib, and it's being towed, as we will see, to the place of conservation. This is a view of the Vasa, looking down on the Vasa before, just as it was breaking the surface with the pontoons that carried it. Now, obviously this was a complete battleship, and the holds were full of everything, all the organic material, the shoes, the leather belts, the skeletons, were all very much there. So it became a great archaeological dig in a way. But the technical problem was that this wood, which had been underwater for 3 centuries, was stable as long as it was underwater, but it couldn't be permitted to dry out before it was conserved. So the entire skeleton was moved into a new shelter, a dock, in which saturated atmospheres could be maintained, and then every cubic inch of this fabric and everything in it was injected with polyurethanes, chemicals, which converted this pulpy, wooden fabric into a new kind of material that looks like wood but actually is as hard as stone. And this is the new museum which was built for the vessel, and all the artifacts that were found on it are displayed there. And as a result of this, the Swedish government has been able to write a whole new chapter in naval architecture. I think this is the last one. No. A final form of intervention, which usually is the most dangerous of all, is the reconstruction of vanished structures. It's dangerous culturally. We've found that most reconstructions have turned out to be really not very accurate, not very successful. But nevertheless, from time to time, there seems to be a need of one. And this is a reconstruction, again in Prague, of the Protestant chapel from which Jan Hus, the Martin Luther of Middle Europe, in which he preached his sermons. And the location of the building was known, and a few years ago it was decided to reconstruct this building because of its symbolic importance to the Czechs. The last, I'm sorry, this is upside down. Can that be reversed? The story is funny enough without showing the picture upside down. This is Niagara Falls that you're looking at. There's a very large artifact, and one that Americans have been very proud of, very conscious of for many years. And now the question is being raised in very serious terms as to how we should conserve this artifact. Is it possible to reverse it? Well, here it's reversed in every direction. Right. Here, the American Falls, the American side of the falls, is under the control of the U.S. Corps of Engineers, the people who, for reasons that we've entirely forgotten why they run our water systems, but they do with an eye and a hand. And a few years ago, and they're very conscious of their responsibility in the preservation of this great artifact. And they're very jealous of the Canadian Falls because they say that the American Falls develops so much mist. Now, this is quoting directly from a report, that the American Falls has the drawback of producing so much fog that tourists on the boats can't see it as clearly as they can see the Canadian Falls. So they thought that we should intervene in this process and make it easier to see the American Falls. So they have seriously developed a whole report on technological means of doing this. And fundamentally they think to do this, they have to get rid of the scree, all this broken stone at the base, which is, of course, what causes the mist. But the scree, of course, is broken off of the ledge by the falling water. So they decided there's no point in getting rid of the scree unless they consolidated the falls. So they have, in all seriousness, a scheme for making the falls into a reinforced concrete structure. You know, and the fact that geological process is involved here apparently never occurs to them. But this is a funny story, but on the other hand, it indicates to us very clearly that we do have this capacity. And though I'm not in favor of consolidating the Niagara Falls, the time may very well come when we'll want to apply this technique to some other important and endangered artifact. Well, that's the substance of what I wanted to tell you. I hope this succeeds in showing you, on the one hand, the enormous range of problems that we face, and on the other hand, the very exciting jobs that are implicit in it if we take it seriously. Thank you.